3 years ago, the CBI set its cap on the mid-market. We published a report called Future Champions, which tried to identify where the dynamo for growth was in the British economy at a point when the British economy was having a pretty flat trajectory. 3 years on, I'm as convinced today as I was then that it's the mid-market and medium-sized businesses that are the true dynamo of growth for our economy. We've surveyed you in a survey we published this morning. Half of you expect to have growth in the next 5 years as high as you can possibly aim at. That's why many of you are the gazelles of the economy. And that same survey showed that over the last 3 years, that hasn't necessarily been easy years. Half of the respondents to our MSB survey this morning had sales growth of more than 10% per annum for each of those 3 years. So it's no surprise to me that a group of companies, a pretty well-defined group of companies, no more than 2% of all the businesses in Britain, are actually worth 25% of UK sales and 20% of UK employment. So why wouldn't we focus on the mid-market? We know who you are, we know how to reach you, we know what help you need, but by just reaching 10,000 British companies, we can multiply the growth of a quarter of the economy. That's the prize. But 3 years ago, when the CBI started talking about you as future champions, nobody else was listening. This was not a market that was well defined. It was not a market that the CBI had previously targeted, that with respect, the banks were necessarily focusing on in difficult times. It certainly wasn't where the city was putting its focus. And as for government policy, well, most of it stopped helping businesses when they hit that magic figure of £10 million turnover. It was like pushing a teenager out of the nest. You were on your own from then on. 3 years on, I think we can look with some pride at having changed the dial. I think I'm halfway down the road of getting one phrase in the Oxford English Dictionary abolished. And the phrase I want abolished is the term SME, or SME. I hate the term SME with a vengeance because it pulls together two asset classes which are at different ends of a growth spectrum. Of course we need Startup Britain. I love it when the Prime Minister stands next to some student who's just designed a fantastic new app in his bedsit. That is great. But we also need Scale-up Britain. And we've had far more Startup Britain than Scale-up Britain. It's not that we shouldn't focus on S's, it's that we should also focus on M's. And the problem with the term SME is that for too long it became synonymous with startup rather than a focus on scale-up. I can't remember the number of occasions, there are just too many of them, in the last 3 years when I've been in the corridors of Westminster and backbench MPs have had one subject of conversation. Are small businesses receiving the bank loans they need? A perfectly legitimate question, but not the only question or even the most important question about growth for dynamic businesses. Yet it's the only question that's been asked because SME has become synonymous with small. I think there's a different brand name we should have out there. The CBI's ambition is to grow a British Mittelstand, and I see you as our Mittelstand. Look at what the Mittelstand has done for the German economy. Look at what the Mittelstand has done for German exports. If we could capture half of that in this country, we'd be doing phenomenally well. You can define the Mittelstand how you want. As far as I'm concerned, the companies that I'm particularly, but not exclusively interested in, are those with a turnover between 10 and 100 million, because those are the companies that have ceased to get the support from government that SEs get, but are the springboard for the sort of Mittelstand companies that we see in Germany, with 2, 3, 5, 700 million turnover euros, many of which, thankfully, we'd be pleased to call large companies. So there's the opportunity. In Future Champions, a CBI report that set off this campaign, we identified 3 clusters that we needed to help you on. One was ambition for growth, the second was capability for growth, and the third was capital for growth. And Declan, just before I pause, want to touch on each of them very, very briefly. On ambition, I think we are now motoring. In the same CBI survey we've published this morning, disappointingly, only 28% of the companies in the 10 to 100 million turnover bracket considered themselves medium-sized companies. That says we've still some work to do on the brand. But do you know you can see those companies growing, whether they're steady growing or the smaller percentage of really important gazelle-style companies, you can see those companies growing all the time. If you want some tonic in your gin, it's more than likely nowadays to come from Fever Tree, a fantastic company that's quadrupled its sales in the last 3 years. Think about what Benoit the architects have done. From blue water to now operating as a 40 million turnover business in 50 countries around the world with 9 overseas offices. I could go on. There is a range of companies which show that that brand is really powerful. Has government changed the dial? Yes, it has. I persuaded Ian Livingstone as Trade and Investment Minister, newly in post, that his first job, and he did it, was to write to every one of those 10,000 companies and offer UKTI support. Without in any way disparaging the export potential of small companies, I think it's much more powerful for medium-sized companies to go to the China market. I'll settle for 10,000 M's in China rather than 100,000 S's, half of which would get eaten for breakfast. I think we'll see in the autumn statement on Wednesday some further announcements from the Treasury on medium-sized businesses. And I certainly think when you look at what is happening with one of the Prime Minister's favourite themes, which is reshoring, bringing back supply chains to the UK, if you look at what's happening in automotive and in aerospace, to give 2 examples, we are seeing a deepening of large corporate responsibility for the M's on which they depend for innovation and growth. And we're seeing some signs of corporate venturing that simply weren't here before the financial crisis. What about the issue of capability? Well, in our survey this morning, 3/4 of you are facing technical level skill shortages and 50% of you middle management skill shortages. In some ways, and I don't say this flippantly, that's quite a nice problem to have because it shows that you are growing fast and you need to source more capacity and capability. But skills is one of the things that will hold this economy back unless we get on top of it, and it's one of the things where you need most help. And I think we need in this area, Declan, a coalition of the willing, a range of agencies, including Britain's universities and business schools, to help provide you with the expertise you need to grow. Because we know that a fast growth business suddenly finds itself in areas that the owner-manager or the excellent inventor or the excellent marketeer who set up that business doesn't necessarily have on their own the skills to deal with. In our survey, 61% of you are already exporting. 1/3 of you are exporting in Asia. We are seeing companies who haven't flown the world in their working lives because for the size they've depended on the home market, the Benelux countries, Germany and Ireland, now looking at Colombia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Mexico City, chasing the growth that is in those markets and with the scale as medium-sized businesses to do something about it. Finally then, capital for growth. I've already touched on the issue of bank lending. We have as an economy been much more dependent on bank lending than some of our competitors. You know the figures, 60% in the UK, only 20% in the United States. And Britain's banks have had many challenges over the last 5 years, particularly as government have insisted that they build up more capital and use risk-weighted assets. So the challenge for our banks has been to increase their lending whilst delivering government and regulatory expectations. And we've seen both a demand and a supply side challenge in this regard. I'm delighted, Antonio, that you've supported us at this event, and I'm delighted you're here today, because I think Lloyds has a fantastic record of reaching out to growth companies with loan finance. But there's much more we need to do. 2014 will be the year, according to the Bank of England, that alternative sources of finance equal bank lending in scale for the first time. And that is a really important complement to what we ask our bank leaders to do. They're not either-ors, we need both. And at long last, we're getting both. The alternative finance arena is very different from what it was 4 years ago. But there's still an awful lot we need to do. The private placement market is much smaller in this country than it is in some of our key competitor nations. Again, the contrast with America is striking. I'm probably talking there about the bigger M's, closer to the top of my range, because we're probably talking of issuings of something of the order of 10 million sterling. But this is an important market we need to develop. And I still think there's more to do and still more for government to do. We still need to get the Solvency II rules right if insurance companies are to be able to build that market in the UK. I'd still like to see more done in the retail bond market. We often use the example of that fine company, Hotel Chocolat, that had the imagination to offer a chocolate bond and to find that consumers were very interested in taking up a chocolate bond. But the retail market in this country is still something we're scratching the surface on. There is a lot more we could do. But if we're serious about doing it, we would need to look at the Prospectus Directive and how it's implemented by the Financial Conduct Authority to make sure that consumers are excited and liberated by this market, not closed out of it. And then there's equity. The equity figures in the UK in your constituency are also behind the curve. About 2% of medium-sized businesses in Britain use external equity. In Scandinavia, it's 10%. How do we change that dial? Well, again, I'm encouraged by the progress since we started our Future Champions campaign. I worked with Xavier Rollet last year to get stamp duty abolished for companies on the AIM market share transactions. And look at what that single intervention by the Chancellor, which cost him a few score millions, has done. There were 62 IPOs on AIM in the last year. There's more liquidity on AIM today than at any point since 2007. Look as well at what the Business Growth Fund has been able to do. More than £400 million of investment funded by the shareholders in the banks to 75 growing companies in the last few years, particularly in the last year alone, I think £200 million worth of investment. This is making a major difference and filling a gap that Germany had filled, but we didn't. There's still more we could do. I would like to see more retail investment in your companies, and I'd like to see more retail investors holding shares in your company for the longer term, for more than 5 years, not just for 18 months. And that could be done if we persuaded the Chancellor in the next government to make some changes to capital gains tax to incentivise long-term investment. So Declan, in summing up, I think this is such an important debate. It's not just another summit by the CBI, it's focusing on the companies that can most significantly add wealth to our economy, heal our economic model, and boost our economic prospects. 3 years ago, we wouldn't have been having a medium-sized business summit because nobody was focused on this challenge. I think we've made good progress in the last 3 years on raising ambition, on creating coalitions of the willing, on raising the capability, in supporting you in export markets, and perhaps most importantly, to oil the wheels, focusing on what we can do to help you with patient capital, both debt and equity. But every time you climb a hill, when you get to the top, you see another hill behind that's even higher. There's more to do because we're on a roll. This is a march, and it's a march to create a British Mittelstand that I'm really proud that CBI is associated with. Thank you very much.